You're wedged between a banker in a navy suit and a teenager whose trousers appear to be defying gravity. Now rewind 4 centuries. Same city, same rush-hour crush, but the fellow next to you is sporting a velvet pouch the size of a small guinea pig strapped to his crotch. Bejeweled, perhaps, and definitely monogrammed. Yes, that's merely Tuesday in 1545. Tonight, we're rifling through the nation's wardrobe to unearth the strangest garments ever to scandalize British men. From the codpiece that shouted a man's virility, to the corset that whispered his shame, each tells a darker story of status, sex, and syphilis. Seatbelts fastened, splendid. Because when it comes to utterly balmy fashion choices, British gentlemen have never been ones to do things by halves, or quietly for that matter. For centuries, being a well-dressed British gentleman was rather like navigating a particularly treacherous game of social snakes and ladders. One wrong fashion choice, and you'd slide from eligible bachelor down to moral disgrace, faster than you could say inappropriate neckwear. This is the story of Britain's most shocking sartorial scandals, where male fashion was less about subtle elegance and more about making statements so bold they required their own postcode. We're talking about chaps who padded their groins to supernatural proportions, squeezed themselves into corsets that would make a Victorian lady weep with envy, and wore wigs so elaborate they required their own structural engineers. We're peeling back the layers of polite society, think onions with a side of scandal, to reveal the truly bonkers male fashion statements that had the nation clutching its pearls. From anatomical exaggerations that would make a modern gentleman blush harder than a tomato in July, to effeminate flourishes that sparked outrage equivalent to discovering a Marmite shortage, we'll examine the hidden reasons behind these trends and the furious backlashes they invariably provoked. From the lavish courts of the Tudors, where more is more was the mantra, to the refined streets of Regency London, British men used their clothing not merely to cover themselves, but to declare their status, virility, or lack thereof, and even their political leanings, often with utterly outlandish results. But, as we'll discover, every bold sartorial statement came with its own hefty dose of moral outrage, impracticality, or whispered scandal. The delicate balance between masculine respectability and fashionable excess was quite a delicate act, as you'll soon see. So, prepare yourself for a journey through Britain's most controversial wardrobes, where the pursuit of style often trumped both common sense and, arguably, common decency. You might enjoy a stiff gin and tonic with this one, the codpiece, an anatomical assertion gone mad. Let's kick off with perhaps the most gloriously audacious fashion statement in British history, the codpiece. Picture this: you're a Tudor gentleman, and your wedding tackle isn't merely clothed, it's been given its own architectural department, complete with planning permission, and possibly a small plaque commemorating its magnificence. Originally, codpieces bridged the gap between separate leg coverings, practical, modest, and thoroughly British in its understated functionality. But by the 1540s, this humble garment had ballooned into a museum-worthy display for the royal anatomy. Tudor codpieces became elaborate affairs that would put a peacock to shame, decorated with embroidery, jewels, or precious metals that cost more than most people's houses and padded to humongous dimensions. In fact, a few smart chaps realized they could be doubled up as convenient storage for coins, handkerchiefs, or love letters. I do have to agree, that's quite useful. Perhaps the world's first designer man bags in every sense. King Henry VIII himself sported a particularly magnificent specimen, which rather suited his larger-than-life personality and his well-documented obsession with producing male heirs. So, naturally, his codpiece announced his intentions from several streets away. The fashion reached such gloriously ridiculous extremes that even the clergy, not exactly known for their wild fashion sense, condemned codpieces as lewd and indecent, arguing they drew undue attention to certain areas of the body. Puritan preachers thundered from pulpits about the sinful pride these garments represented, though one suspects they may have been slightly jealous of the impressive silhouettes on display. But here's where our tale takes a rather grimmer turn. Some historians reckon the codpiece's popularity served a more practical, if deeply ironic, purpose. The 16th century saw syphilis tearing through Europe's upper classes like a particularly unwelcome party guest, and the disease's effects on male anatomy were, shall we say, visually apparent and thoroughly disappointing to all concerned. The elaborate padding may have served to conceal the unfortunate realities of venereal disease whilst maintaining the illusion of masculine vigor. A rather sobering thought, really. Such an ostentatious display of virility might actually have been masking its tragic absence. Pity. The monstrous ruff, neck-breaking vanity. If anatomical enhancement wasn't sufficiently aggrandized to scandalize polite society, imagine trying to enjoy your meal whilst wearing a linen satellite dish around your neck. Welcome to the world of the Elizabethan ruff. What began as modest frills around the collar evolved into colossal cartwheel ruffs that could measure up to a foot in width. That's about 30 centimeters. These architectural marvels were meticulously constructed from yards of fine linen, pleated with the mathematical precision of a Swiss watchmaker, starched to rigid perfection, and supported by wire frameworks. The sheer bloody-minded impracticality of these ruffs made everyday activities an exercise in careful choreography. Eating required specialized long spoons to navigate around the starched barrier. Reading meant holding books at arm's length. Turning one's head became a deliberate, considered movement, rather like being permanently trapped in an elaborate paper doily. Yet gentlemen embraced these restrictions, viewing them as symbols of refinement and social elevation. The more impractical your ruff, the more obvious it became that you belonged to the leisure classes, respectable blokes who could afford servants to help them dress and didn't need to concern themselves with such mundane activities as being able to see their own feet. Puritan commentators, predictably, went sheer barmy about these great and monstrous ruffes, condemning them, also, as symbols of sinful pride and decadent waste. They railed against the vanity and extravagance these garments represented, dubbing starch itself the devil's liquor, a substance that enabled such prideful displays of worldly vanity. Even Queen Elizabeth I, a woman who could make a Christmas tree look underdressed, attempted to control the ruff epidemic through sumptuary laws. She decreed maximum widths and restricted certain styles to the nobility, but unfortunately, it was as effective as controlling wild hen nights through parliamentary legislation. Corsets for gentlemen, the unmanly squeeze. Picture this. You're an 18th century gentleman, and your morning routine may not only include shaving or powdering your wig, but also being laced into a garment designed to reshape your entire torso, like some sort of human origami project. Men's stays, as they were politely termed, were considered absolutely essential for achieving the ideal masculine silhouette. A trim waist, broad chest, and ramrod straight posture announced your refinement to the world. The practice reached its gloriously ridiculous peak during the Regency era, with the rise of the dandy, those arbiters of masculine elegance. These gentlemen would submit to being squeezed into their stays with religious devotion, often requiring assistance from valets who approached the task with the grim determination of bomb disposal experts. The goal was achieving the dramatically narrow waist that fashion demanded, even if it meant risking internal organ rearrangement in the process. The sight of grown men being laced into corsets became so common that satirical prints of the era regularly depicted dandies being comically compressed into their garments, their faces reddening with exertion as servants hauled on the laces with the enthusiasm of sailors hoisting anchor. One particularly cruel cartoon showed a dandy so tightly corseted he appeared ready to burst like an overstuffed Christmas turkey, whilst his valet stood by with what appeared to be a bicycle pump, presumably for emergency reinflation. The backlash was swift and merciless. Critics condemned male corsetry as a sign of dangerous effeminacy, arguing that real men should achieve their physique through natural means rather than artificial enhancement. Rather rich, considering these same critics likely owned more wigs than a theatrical costume department. The practice was denounced as unmanly and unnatural, with wearers accused of aping women and abandoning their masculine nature for what amounted to structural support for the torso. More troubling still, male corsetry was often characterized as fundamentally un-British. In an era when Britain was defining itself in opposition to continental European decadence, the sight of Englishmen squished into stays suggested a troubling loss of national character. I'm not sure if I should feel sad. The macaroni, the height of absolute ridiculousness. Now imagine encountering a creature so completely removed from conventional masculinity that observers struggled to determine whether they were looking at a human or possibly some sort of elaborate street performance character that got out of hand. Welcome to the world of the macaroni. You're strolling through London during the 1760s or 1770s, minding your own business, when a strange being passes you in the form of a gentleman. His favorite red, high-heeled shoes with decorative buckles clop loudly as he swaggers by. He sports a towering, elaborately powdered wig, often tinted blue or purple, because natural hair colors were for peasants. A tiny tricorn hat sits atop. Enormous ostrich feathers nod from his headpiece with each mincing step, whilst his body is draped in vibrant silks and velvets decorated with embroidery. Like a flamboyant, exotic bird that had raided Liberace's wardrobe and gone completely bonkers. His face and neck are adorned with artificial beauty marks or mouches, French for flies. These adhesive patches were made of silk, taffeta, or velvet, and came in a variety of shapes, including hearts, spades, clubs, crescents, stars, and more. Worn by both men and women of the time, their placement operated like a secret code. For example, near the eye suggested passion, the mouth, availability for romance. The grim truth is that most wore beauty patches to cover the deep, pitted scars left by smallpox. The macaronis were typically young men of considerable wealth who had completed the grand tour of Europe and returned to Britain determined to shock their compatriots with continental sophistication. They exaggerated every current fashion trend to absolutely bonkers extremes. If buttons were fashionable, theirs were the size of dinner plates. These extraordinary creatures' affected mincing gaits would make a prima ballerina look clumsy. They spoke in deliberately artificial accents, peppered with French and Italian phrases, as it would be too pedestrian otherwise, and displayed an obsession with their appearance that consumed their entire existence. The term Yankee Doodle was actually coined to mock this very style. The song's reference to sticking a feather in his hat and calling it macaroni was a deliberate satire of these overdressed fops, who believed that excessive ornamentation equaled sophistication. The macaronis, too, had their satirical prints, depicted as creatures neither male nor female, their gender rendered as ambiguous as a politician's campaign promise. More seriously, their effeminate appearance often led to accusations of homosexuality. The charge carried severe legal and social consequences in Georgian Britain, making their fashion choices not just ridiculous, but genuinely dangerous. The periwig: status, scrutiny, and stench. The powdered wig, that ubiquitous symbol of 18th century masculine elegance, carried with it a host of secrets. You're a Georgian gentleman, and perched upon your head is not merely a fashion accessory, but a complex statement. It's about status, hygiene, and the extraordinary lengths to which men would go to maintain appearances, whilst simultaneously creating entirely new problems for themselves. The periwig's introduction to British fashion followed Charles II's return from exile in France, where he'd observed the elaborate court fashions of Louis XIV and thought, right, we definitely need some of that ridiculousness back home. What began as royal affectation quickly became social necessity. By the early 18th century, no gentleman could appear in public without his properly powdered and styled wig. These were substantial constructions, often shoulder length or longer, crafted from human hair, horse hair, or goat hair, depending on your budget and social aspirations. By the way, did you know that human hair was frequently imported from peasant women who sold their locks for survival? It was the 18th century equivalent of selling your possessions on eBay during tough times. But using the finest human hair wasn't enough. They liberally dusted their wigs with powder made from finely ground flour. In fact, they used flour so much that the British Army alone used tons of it annually for their officers' wigs. Maybe that explains rather a lot about historical food shortages. The practical challenges of wearing those monstrosities were rather nutty. Wigs were incredibly heavy, making them hot and uncomfortable to wear for extended periods, rather like wearing a small sheep on your head in a heat wave. They required constant maintenance by specialized wig makers who charged accordingly, and yet they would still harbor populations of lice that would make a medieval peasant's scalp look positively pristine by comparison. Samuel Pepys famously worried about purchasing wigs made from hair taken from plague victims, a concern that wasn't entirely paranoid given the period's understanding of disease transmission. The man was essentially concerned about catching the plague from his hat, which puts modern hair care anxieties into rather sharp perspective. Yet gentlemen endured these considerable inconveniences because wigs served crucial social and practical functions. Wigs provided uniform height and grandeur, regardless of natural hair quality or quantity, and more pragmatically, they concealed the baldness that frequently resulted from syphilis treatments. These were mercury-based remedies that caused hair loss, along with their other devastating side effects, making the treatment often worse than the disease itself. The cost of maintaining a proper wig wardrobe was absolutely staggering, making them potent symbols of wealth and status. The term big wig, that is still used today, emerged directly from this period, describing men whose social position was literally crowned by their elaborate hairpieces. For the aspiring middle classes, a good wig could mean the difference between social acceptance and exclusion from respectable society. The Great Male Renunciation. Now we're going to take a moment for the story of Beau Brummel and what historians call the Great Male Renunciation, the pivotal moment when British masculinity abandoned centuries of flamboyant excess for something far more subtle, yet infinitely more tyrannical. George Bryan Beau Brummel wasn't born to aristocracy. He was essentially a middle-class lad who managed to revolutionize masculine dress through sheer bloody-minded perfectionism and an almost religious devotion to the art of appearing effortlessly immaculate. Rising to prominence in Regency London, Brummel rejected every excess we've explored: the padding, the jewels, the powdered wigs, the elaborate embroidery, in favor of something far more radical and, frankly, rather threatening in its implications: impeccable tailoring, muted colors, and obsessive attention to cleanliness that bordered on the pathological. Gone were the vibrant blues, pinks, and greens. Dandies favored more subdued, sophisticated colors: dark blues, grays, browns, and black for formal wear. Who would have thought that a modest, modern fashion sense was once seen by the highest and mightiest as something from nightmares? Brummel's revolution lay not in what he added to masculine dress, but in what he stripped away. His uniform consisted of a perfectly fitted dark coat over pristine white linen that would make a swan weep with envy. Below, buff-colored breeches and boots polished to such mirror brightness they could probably blind passing aircraft. The effect was stunning in its restraint. Every line clean, every surface immaculate, every detail precisely calculated to appear natural, an act that was unnatural in of itself. The man who would reshape masculine fashion spent up to 5 hours each morning in his toilette, not applying cosmetics or adjusting padding, but achieving a level of cleanliness and precision that bordered on the obsessive. He reportedly went through dozens of neckcloths each morning, discarding any that weren't tied to absolute perfection. His daily bath, revolutionary in itself for an era when most people considered water a suspicious, foreign substance, became the subject of society gossip and was probably more interesting than the latest celebrity baby. What makes Brummel's influence so remarkable is that he achieved supreme social power through nothing more than impeccable taste and self-presentation, like becoming Prime Minister, thanks to perfectly pressed trousers. He could make or break reputations with a raised eyebrow or a witty observation about another man's cravat. Even the Prince Regent, the future King George IV, and a man not known for his modesty, sought his approval. When the prince once asked Brummel's opinion of his new coat, Brummel simply looked him up and down and told his companion, "Ring the bell, we will go upstairs," essentially dismissing royalty like a badly dressed servant. Imagine having such fashion authority that you could slag off the future king's wardrobe and get away with it. But here's the conclusively tragic twist. Even the architect of modern menswear couldn't escape the darker currents that have always flowed beneath fashionable society, like sewage under a beautiful street. Brummel's downfall came through gambling debts, a catastrophic falling out with the Prince Regent, and ultimately exile to France, where he discovered that being perfectly dressed doesn't pay the rent. He died in poverty and madness, his final years marked by the ravages of syphilis, the very disease that some of those peculiar earlier fashions may have been designed to conceal. The tragic irony is surely perfect. The man who revolutionized masculine dress by emphasizing cleanliness and natural perfection was ultimately consumed by the same social pressures and physical ailments that had driven centuries of bizarre fashion choices. The dark undercurrents of health, hygiene, and social anxiety remained constant, even as the clothes changed. From the bold audacity of the Tudor codpiece to the quiet control of Brummel's perfectly tied cravat, British male fashion has always been a battleground of social fears, personal expression, and amazing impracticality. These clothing adventures reveal that what we wear isn't just fabric, it's a powerful statement about who we are and what society expects of us. Each crazy fashion we've explored tells a deeper story about the men who wore them. The codpiece announced manliness, whilst possibly hiding its sad absence. The ruff showed status through deliberate impracticality. The corset reshaped the male body for an artificial ideal. The macaroni challenged every assumption about gender whilst appearing to defy physics. The powdered wig hid reality whilst creating new problems. What's fascinating is how each fashion movement caused moral panic and social chaos, yet ultimately helped evolve masculine identity. Every generation looks back at their predecessors' clothing with horror, certain they'll finally achieve perfect balance, only to be judged equally harshly by their successors. The medical and social worries that drove these fashion choices, concerns about disease, status, manliness, and acceptance, haven't disappeared. They've simply moved into new forms of clothing expression that future historians will find equally crazy, whilst wondering why we paid premium prices for jeans with holes or obsessed over trainers costing more than holidays. What does your wardrobe say about you? Will future historians puzzle over our obsession with athleisure, vintage band t-shirts, or queuing hours for trainers, then dubbed too precious to wear? If you've enjoyed these bizarre clothing tales from Britain's past, hit that like button and subscribe. Tell us in the comments, which fashion shocked you most?